So bonjour and welcome everyone. My name is Linda Witt. I'm the president of the Fédération des Alliances Françaises USA. I'm coming to you today from Portland in Oregon. I'd like to introduce Melissa Sora. She's our National Programs Administrator. She manages all the technology for these sessions, and Melissa is in Washington, D.C.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Thanks, Melissa. So, we are expecting a large audience today, so I'll make some brief opening comments to give everyone a chance to get into the room and to tell you about some of our other programming that's coming up. I do have first, however, well, let me go ahead and talk about the upcoming events. Sorry, I got my order mixed up there. Okay. This event is part of a series that is free to Alliance Française members, free to our partners, free to our friends, to the Alliance, to the AATF, and others. And we have some other sessions coming up soon. We have a really great session coming with the author of The City of Immortals in just 5 days. And then we have a conversation with Joe Myers and Tatiana de Rosnay on the Flowers of Darkness. And then about mid-May, we have an Apéro National Conversation group that brings together about 150 people from across the United States to simply enjoy speaking French. And then we have our program also in French on May 13th, also mid-May, with Charles Coulon, and he'll be talking about Le Métro dans les Arts. So visit your local Alliance Française chapter or afusa.org to find out more about these presentations, which, as I said, they are free, and so please do enjoy them. Another thing, a quick thing about the Alliance Française in the United States, for those of you who are not already taking classes, we do have not only, we traditionally have had classes in the classroom, but of course, because of the pandemic, we offer a tremendous number and quality of classes at our online rather than in the classroom. So if you haven't checked it out, please do contact your local chapter or the chapter that's closest to you. Thank you. Next slide, Melissa. And now I want to talk just a little bit about the logistics and format. I know some of you have been with us before and you've gone through this, but some of you are new to our audience today. So we're going to ask you to stay on mute during the presentation. That way, none of us have the distractions of dogs barking and so forth. We will encourage you to use the chat feature for submitting questions or comments during the question that we will cover later during the question and answer period. You should be staying on speaker view throughout the presentation today. We will also have some screen shares throughout the presentation, and that gives you the opportunity on your end, depending on your device that you're on, you can resize the images. So if you need to see a photo larger, you can make it larger. If you'd like to see Janet larger, you can see Janet larger. That's up to you. And then, for the most part, this technology is pretty dependable, but occasionally we've had people get booted out of sessions. Who knows what happens, right? So in the event of something like that happening, please know that you should go ahead and just wait a minute, maybe, and then come back into the Zoom session using the same link. And then I have to tell you that this event is being recorded. We record all of our events and we put them up on YouTube for people that missed them or for other people that would like to watch them. So if you have any issues with that, then now would be the time to leave. And then our total runtime today will be right around an hour. And then it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Janet Hulstrand. Janet is a writer, editor, writing coach, and teacher of writing and literature. She wears many hats. She's originally from Iowa, but she has 4 decades of experience living, working, teaching, and traveling in France. So she's the expert. She also leads writing workshops in the Champagne region and teaches for the City University of New York every summer. In today's session, we're going to hear from Janet about her journey that's taken her to know France and the French so very well. She'll be sharing her very unique bicultural insights. We'll be discussing her book, Demystifying the French, which I have here in the Kindle version. and I've just finished reading it. It's designed to help readers avoid mistakes, even from the get-go of landing in France for the first time, for example. The book begins with 5 essential tips for even the briefest of encounters, and then it paves the way for a positive experience in France. Then those key tips are followed by 10 chapters that go into a deeper explanation of French habits, manners, their way of viewing the world, and the historic roots for some of those tendencies, shall we say. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Janet. Merci beaucoup for being with us here today.
Well, thank you so much, Linda, for inviting me, and thank you to the Alliance Française for sponsoring this, for hosting this event. It's really wonderful for me to be able to talk about my book to an Alliance Française audience. The Alliance Française has been very important in my development as a Francophile and a speaker of French. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as I go. I've got a little slideshow where what I want to do is sort of start by telling you the whole story of how I came to be so enthralled with France and the French language. And actually, I know why Linda said I'm from Iowa. It's because I'm working on a book called A Long Way from Iowa, but it is actually my grandmother who was the Iowan. I grew up in Minnesota. So anyway, so people often ask me, where did all this start? When did you become so fascinated with France? Why are you so fascinated with France? Where does it come from? And I always say that actually, I don't really know for sure why, because it happened so long ago. I was a kid. I was a child. I don't know how old. All I know is that from the time I knew there was such a place as France, where they spoke this incredibly beautiful language that I heard somewhere. I think I might have first heard French because I was growing up in Minnesota, and my family wasn't French. I didn't know any French people. I didn't know anyone who was particularly interested in French or France. So where did it come from? Well, my mother loved Broadway musicals, and she was always playing the soundtracks of musicals in our house. And I think maybe what happened is that we had a Cole Porter, we had the soundtrack for the Cole Porter musical Can Can, which takes place in Gay Paris of the gay 90s in Paris. And there's a few songs that have a few French phrases or sentences. And I think I probably heard them and thought, wow, where do they speak that language? It is so beautiful. I want to go there. And so what I did is, as soon as I was able to study French, I did. And for me, that was at the age of 14. I took it in my high school, first year French, and I took 4 years of French in high school. And then I studied French a bit in college, a couple of years in college, but I did not major in French. And then as soon as I got out of college, what I wanted to do was get to Europe, and in most particular, get to France. So I had to figure out a way to do that, and I had to save up money. And eventually, at the age of 25, I finally got there for the first time. And so, Melissa, you could show the first slide now. So this is me in 1978. It was the fall of 1978 when I finally made it to France. And this is me actually, in a looking out a window in this old sort of farmhouse in Essoyes, the village in Champagne where I live now. And looking very excited to be in France, which indeed I was. And why was I there? Well, you can show the next slide now. All right, so I was in Essoyes, in this little village in southern Champagne, because it was the time of the vendange. The vendange is the grape harvest. And what you see here in this picture on the lower left is you see some Pinot Noir grapes. And what you see on the upper right is my grape picking partner looking through the vines. The way I came to be there is that this person, I met in Paris. When I first got to Paris, I met a couple of Americans, and we spent some time together, went to a movie and so on. And they had a French friend who was a friend of a vigneron, a grape grower in Essoyes. And it was early October, which is when the vendange used to be. It's much earlier now. It's usually late August or early September. But it was early October, and this friend of the friend was looking for people to help in the harvest. And so I had this extraordinary opportunity to go and pick grapes for 10 days in Champagne, and I grabbed the opportunity. And so we were there picking grapes. It's usually about 10 days, the harvest. And the vigneron, Jacques, the farmer for whom we picked grapes, after the harvest was over, he really extended his friendship to us. He liked us, and he said, you can stay in that place you're staying in. It was sort of a bunkhouse, really. You can stay there as long as you want. He invited us he took us all around, showed us how the grapes were pressed and everything. He invited us to a meal at his home. His wife was a magnificent cook, and prepared a meal for us that none of us will ever forget. Lasted many hours, and it was extraordinary. And then, finally we it was time to go, and he drove us to Dijon to catch the train. And we just sort of so that friendship started back in 1978, and we kept it through the years. So you could show the next slide. So this is after the vendange. We all went back to Paris, these two guys and I. And by the way, the one you see in the picture here eventually became my husband. He was living in a roulette, a gypsy caravan on the banks of the Marne, just outside of Paris. It's called La Roulette in French. And so he was there, he was living there and studying at the Beaux-Arts in Paris. He's an artist. And I continued my journey. I had a Euro pass. I went to the Netherlands. I went to Spain for a few weeks. But I kept kind of coming back to Paris, partly because it's very central, and partly because I wanted to learn French, and partly because I was falling in love. But anyway, so you can show the next slide now. So what ended up happening is then we ended up spending a lot of time in that roulette for a couple of years. And then in 1980, we moved to New York. And in 1997, I was given the opportunity to create a course for the nascent study abroad program at Hunter College, which is part of the City University of New York. And it was an extraordinary opportunity. I was basically told, think of a class you'd like to teach, think a place you'd like to go, a class you'd like to teach there, and write up a proposal. And so I could have done it anywhere in the world, but I chose to do it in Paris. It was initially called Paris Through the Eyes of Travelers, and it was offered through Hunter. It's still being offered, although not this year for obvious reasons. But it's now called Paris: A Literary Adventure, and it's offered by through Queen's College, which is also part of CUNY. So what I created was a class that was all mostly American writing, but all about France, about Paris, about the experience of being an American in Paris by all these wonderful American writers. And so I got to offer that class almost every year from 1997 until just a couple of years ago. And hopefully we will get started again when the pandemic lets up. But so this is a group of my students. They've just given their oral presentation, their final oral presentation on the Champ de Mars, and there they are in Paris. And so this was wonderful because what it meant is that every summer we were able to come to France for a whole month. By this time, we were married and had started a family. the first year I did the class, our older son had his 4th birthday in Paris. And then our younger boy was not even 2 yet. So from the time they were very small, they were able to spend all this wonderful time in Paris, and they both still really love it. It was a wonderful opportunity for us. Then, let's see, I'm trying to think, I think you can move to the next slide. Yes, in 2001, we moved to Washington, D.C. Oh, but I forgot to tell you, I knew I was forgetting something about New York. So, and about Paris, because I wanted to tell you about how important the Alliance has been to me all along this path. When we were living in Paris, I studied I sold pots and pans in the mornings and went to, with a friend in the village that we were staying in, and then studied at the Alliance Françaises in the afternoons. It was wonderful. I mean, at that point, I would think I was an advanced beginner class, which consisted of, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 people in the class, maybe not quite that many, mostly young, but not completely, people from all different countries. And the thing that we had in common was French, trying to learn French. And it was a wonderful experience. It was on the Rue de Fleurus, which, or at least it is now. I don't even actually remember if that's where I took the classes, but that's the street that Gertrude Stein lived on. Anyway, so I had studied at the Alliance Française there. And then when we moved to New York, by then my French was good enough that I was able to take literature classes. And I had a wonderful teacher in New York. I'll never forget. I mean, she introduced us to so many good French writers. And so anyway, and then when we moved to Washington, I didn't take classes anymore, but I went to a number of really interesting events and book events of friends of mine and so on at the Alliance in Washington, D.C. So through all of this travel, the Alliance Française has been there for me in a wonderful way. And I just really want to I'm sorry, I forgot to say that as I was going along. So here in Washington, after I was in Washington for a few years, I had the opportunity to start teaching classes here, so that I wasn't only teaching now every summer in Paris, but Politics and Prose had sort of started up this opportunity for people to take classes at the store. And so so I started teaching classes again. All of the classes were reading about France, not all of them, most of them. And here we are. This was one of the classes. We had just had a Skype session with David Downey, who's written lots of wonderful books about both France and Italy. And we had just had a Skype conversation with him at our class, and we were waving goodbye to him from Politics and Prose. Okay, you can show the next slide, Melissa. And so then in 2007, we made a big move and decided to buy a house in France, which is a whole nother story that I won't go into. It wasn't the most practical thing for us to do in the world in some ways, but it was an adventure and it's turned out well. And so we bought a house. We bought the house in the same village that we had first met, and where we had formed this friendship with Jacques, the vigneron, so many years earlier. This picture, so this is what Essoyes looks like. This is Essoyes on a summer evening. This is last summer. This is a photograph taken by one of my sons. And it's right in the middle of town, and it's lovely, right? And so this is what it looks like in summer. And then you can show the next slide, Melissa. This is in the autumn, and this is actually right out my window. So what you see in the foreground is a field. It's in the autumn, so the field has just been tilled, and what grows in that field usually is either wheat or colza, which is the grain that's used to make canola oil. But in the distance, you can see the vineyards turning colors, and then sort of surrounded by forest. So Essoyes, being in southern Champagne, is really on the border of Burgundy. And Burgundy, of course, is very forested. So we're sort of on the edge of all that. So that's what it looks like in the autumn. And then the next slide will show you something. So in many ways, Essoyes is a kind of typical little French village, which means it's a wonderful place. Little French villages on the whole are wonderful places to be. And but it has this distinction, which is that it was the beloved summer home for many years of the Renoir family. And this is and the town is very proud of this connection. And this is a mural in the town that is a reproduction of a Renoir painting of Jean Renoir as a baby, the famous filmmaker as a baby, being held by his nanny. Gabrielle was one of Renoir's favorite models. And she was from Essoyes, and she was actually a cousin, some kind of cousin of Madame Renoir, who was from Essoyes. It was Madame Renoir that brought Renoir here. He spent most of his life in Paris and wasn't so eager to come initially, because now it only takes about 2.5 hours to get to Essoyes from Paris. But back then it took a lot longer. And it was a sort of sleepy little village, and he wasn't so keen on the idea. But when they started to really grow their family, she sort of started to assert herself, and she really wanted a home in the country in her home village. And so he said, okay. And they came here, and once he got here, he loved it. And so until a few years ago, the great granddaughter of the painter, Pierre Auguste Renoir, her name is Sophie Renoir, she spent time here in the summer and on the weekends with her family. And then a few years ago, she sold the house to the village, and they embarked on this very ambitious project to restore the home to the way it would have been in the late 1890s when the family was living there. And they did a fantastic job. I mean, it's just a small village. They had support from all 3 levels of government, the national, regional, and departemental. But they did a fantastic job of restoring this home. And people, when the pandemic lets up again, people will be able to visit it again. And it's wonderful. I hope some of you out there will plan a trip to Essoyes. Because it's a really interesting place to visit. And the next slide will show you the other reason to visit this area. Oh, I'm sorry, there's the house. I forgot about this slide. So this is a Renoir painting of the house, and this is the one that's been restored now that you can visit. They've set it up so that it really they made it to look as if you're just able to see. The family has been there and gone out for an evening stroll maybe. So there's toys scattered around, and there's brushes next to the easel, and it's all very, very wonderful. It's really well done. So that's what it looks like. And that's in a painting of Renoir. And the next slide shows you what the other reason is to come to this area, and that is that it's Champagne. And so Essoyes and all the little villages around here actually it's really interesting to drive through them, because there's just one place, one Maison de Champagne after another. It's astonishing. And it's mostly small family-run operations. And the people are very accueillant, very welcoming. They like to let you taste the champagne and tell you about their work. Most of them have little displays that sort of explain how the process of making champagne, which is complicated and really interesting. And so that's another good reason to come here. The next slide, Melissa. Okay, so this is me a few years later, or a few years ago at this point, and looking toward the village. This is right outside our home, really. I mean, it's just kind of outside our home. And what you see in the background, this is kind of a nice completing the circle photo for me, because what you see in the background there is not real. It's a pressoir. This is a pressoir that is owned and managed and operated by the daughters of Jacques, the vigneron who first extended his friendship to us and made Essoyes a really special place for us. And we're still friends. So it's kind of a completion of the circle. And then the next slide is not in France at all. This is at a book party in Washington, D.C. that some friends gave for me when my book came out a couple of years ago. And so now we can talk about the book. Linda told you a little bit about how the book is organized. I want to tell you why I wrote the book. I think I'll start by saying why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because it wasn't, I mean, there are a couple of really good books that deal basically with the same area that I wanted to cover in this book. All this time that I was coming to France from 1978 on and having a wonderful time and loving it and everything, nevertheless, I often, in fact, almost always, when I would go into a little shop and come out again, I would have this kind of sad feeling, like I didn't know, I knew I had done something wrong, but I didn't know what. And then somebody gave me Polly Platt's book, French or Faux. And I read it and I thought, oh my gosh, you're supposed to say bonjour first. I didn't know this. And so, it was a light bulb, absolutely, that went on off in my head, and it changed everything. So I knew that there was Polly Platt's book, and there's another book, really good book out too, that came out a few years ago called The Bonjour Effect by Julie Barlow and Jean-Benoit Nadeau. And so I knew that there were these books out there, but I felt like there was room for another book that would be just really short and kind of to the point, and that you could even slip in your bag and or your back pocket even, and that would focus on the most important things to know. So that's the first half of the book, the 5 essential tips, and that's designed sort of for people who you know, maybe are coming to France for the first time and they don't know anything, and they don't want to probably read a whole long book about the French, but they might not mind reading a short book that's going to help them out. And so, and then the second half of the book is for people that that maybe even are living here and still constantly complaining about the French, because, you know, saying, why are they this way? So I in the second half of the book, I tried to sort of get inside the French mentality. According to me, it's my own interpretation, and most of it's told through anecdotes, things that I've experienced and how I've interpreted it. But I wanted to also reach out to some other people so it wouldn't be only my voice. So I asked several of my friends Americans who've lived in France for a long time, Adrian Leeds, who I believe is out there somewhere, David Downey, I don't know if he's here tonight, Penelope Rowlands, Harriet Welty Rochefort. I asked them to sort of answer some questions for me and sort of wove in their perspective on some of these things too. But the main reason that I wrote the book is because all this time, once I knew what to do, I of course would tell my students, you know, you got to, there's these certain things you need to know. But then also it wasn't just, but I sort of watched them struggling with not knowing the essentials, the things that they needed to know in order to function smoothly in France, socially and commercially. It's really everything, any personal interaction. But it wasn't just my students. I would sit in cafes and watch Americans come in and, you know, sort of right off the bat, get off to a bad start. And the thing, you could just see the thing degenerate. And it was really too bad, because the analogy I've come up with recently is that Americans sort of, it's as if these rules of politesse in France are like a china shop, right? With all this lovely, delicate porcelain. And Americans come charging in, sort of like a bull into a china shop, or maybe more like a big friendly golden retriever or something, wagging his tail and knocking everything over. And the French, the American has no idea that they're doing anything wrong. The French are sort of in shock because all of their things are being broken. Their nice, orderly world is being broken. And the Americans, all they notice is that the French aren't very friendly. And they can't figure out why. So that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to try to help people know those things so that they could have a better experience, really. And I think that's pretty much it. Oh, and then I said I would read a little something from the book, just a brief section. I'm going to read from the second half of the book, which is called Understanding the French Mentality. I think probably everybody here already knows about the importance of saying bonjour, and we've already sort of mentioned it anyway. So that's tip number one in the first part of the book. But the second part of the book, the first chapter is called Do They Really Not Understand Me? Or Are They Just Being Mean? Let's begin by saying that there is nothing easy about French pronunciation. Unlike at least some other Romance languages, Italian and Spanish, for example, French pronunciation is not uncomplicated and perfectly reliable. You can't just learn the 5 vowel sounds and count on them to remain the same, predictably, reliably, in fact, almost always. French is full of weird diphthongs, vowel combinations that force a person to screw his or her mouth into shapes that most Anglophones find, quite frankly, just ridiculous. So the first thing is, you have to get over that. And you should also get over the sneaking suspicion that when French people give you that quizzical look, you know the one I mean, that pained expression that seems to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Most of the time, it is probably not because they are being difficult. It is because their language is a difficult one, and they really are trying to figure out what you're trying to say. The first time I arrived in Paris, as one of my first excited acts, I went into a bookstore and asked for a copy of a volume of poems by my favorite French language poet, Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire wasn't that hard to say, but the title of the collection I was looking for, Alcool, was then, and remains for me now, almost impossible to say well enough that a French person can understand what I'm saying. The difficulty is in those 2 O's next to each other. And no, it is not pronounced the way we pronounce 2 O's together. And so the salesperson gave me that quizzical look, the furrowed brow, the slight frown, the cocked head, and crestfallen, I had to write it down for him. Ah, alcool, par Apollinaire, he said, face brightening as he headed toward the right shelf. Well, yes, isn't that what I had said? Apparently not, or in any case, not well enough. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Janet, your last example reminds me of the first time I went to Paris at about the same age that you did. And I swear that to the waiter in the restaurant, I said, Je voudrais un sandwich jambon. And he didn't understand me. And I still, to this day, I wondered how much I butchered it that he didn't understand me. So yeah, I think a lot of us have had that experience. So we have a few questions coming up in the chat, and I encourage everyone to put their questions in the chat because that's what we have time for now. We have plenty of time for that. I did want to ask you, Janet, what do the French think about your book?
Well, so far, so good. I didn't write it for French people. I wrote it for an mainly American audience or other people, other foreigners, really. I mean, anybody who reads English. It wasn't aimed at the French, but I was anxious to know what the French would think of it once they started reading it. And so far, the few reactions that I've had have been really positive. I've had a few people tell me that it's very funny It made them laugh, which was a relief, because I wanted. I mean, it is very lighthearted and sort of humorous, I think, and luckily they also find it. So one friend said that she found that first of all there were things about herself that she didn't realize were really French. And then reading the book, she did. She thought, oh, but that's a French thing. And she also said that she thought it was going to be really helpful. She's in a professional career where she deals with people from all over the world and also with lots with Americans. And she said she thought it was really going to be helpful to her in that regard, in understanding where Americans were coming from. But so I haven't had any French person yet take umbrage. Mostly they've been amused by it, or kind of surprised at some of the perspectives offered.
Well, yeah, and that's, you don't describe the French in a negative light. You simply describe your experience with them and why they think the way that they do. We have a good question from Maria. She would like to know if your perception of the French has changed over the decades that you've gotten to know them and work with them.
I think that it's certainly deepened. That's one of the things that's so wonderful about the French, is that they're really interesting. They're interesting people. They're complicated. There's a whole chapter in my book called A Passion for Complication, which, especially from an American point of view, it's not always a really positive thing. Sometimes when you're having to deal with French bureaucracy, for example, you wish things were a little bit less complicated, but they're very interesting. And so I think that one of the reasons, I don't know if it's changed my opinion of them. I don't think it has changed. I think that I found them really interesting to begin with. And it's a source of endless fascination to learn more about the culture and the people and to read the literature and all of that. I mean, it feels like an endless source of interest. I don't know.
Well, no, that makes total sense, that your perceptions and your understanding has deepened. We have a great question from Robert. Would you like to speak at all on the French sense of humor?
Let's see. Oh, what about the French sense of humor? It's different than ours. Well, I don't know. I think I'm probably borrowing somebody else's perspective, thoughts about this. But I mean, the French don't, I think that it's not, who has written about this? I think Barlow and Doe have written about this actually, that they, it's not a self-deprecating sense of humor for the most part. And that's because the French, generally speaking, have a really high bar that they're always trying to meet for themselves. I mean, it's one of the things that I think is probably, that's one of the things actually in my book I talk about, is that I think that rather than be frustrated or angry with French for being so perfectionist, for example, it's better to understand that the reason that they're that way is because they kind of are raised expected to be perfect. Mm-hmm. Nobody could do that. Mm-hmm. So it's a burden. And so they're not really so comfortable laughing at themselves for the most part. And they're not even, I mean, a lot of the things that we would find funny, or, even joking about ourselves, they don't laugh about that, but they certainly are funny. And I don't know, I'm kind of drawing a blank to think about French comedians. I can think of lots of American and British comedians who deal with life in France, like Sebastian Marx, for example. I don't know if you know him, but he's very funny. But he's American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you said that their humor is very different than our humor, and that's probably the biggest takeaway for people to know, is that humor often doesn't translate from one language to another. I think a couple of people have said that in the chat as well. We have some questions about Essoyes. That's how you pronounce it, right? Essoyes? Okay. You know, there's a lot of curiosity over how old the village is, and we have from the chat that some people say that it's from the Celtic times, and then that there was a big fire in 1763 where most of the village. So the wood timbered buildings that are left, were those the ones that somehow escaped the fire, or you think they were built afterwards?
I don't know. I mean, Essoyes is really old. But there was this big fire that destroyed many buildings in the 1700s, I think, sometime, and that it destroyed the church, so that the church that we have is not as old as many churches are in France. I mean, it's still 19th century, early 19th century, I think, or 18th century probably. No, yeah. But it's ancient. There's a marker in the road, and just when I walk to the village from here, there's a marker that is on the side of the road that was put up by the family of the sole survivor in a family of the plague. So it's been here for a really long time. And I yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then I think it's Diane Van Fossen comments that he's traveled to France several times, found that the French, especially in recent years, want to speak English instead of their native language. Have you seen that on the ground there in France as well?
Well, I hear about that a lot. Because it can be frustrating when somebody spends all this time trying to learn French, and then they come here and they want to speak French, and the people that they encounter want to practice their English. That didn't used to be the case. I mean, it's changed a lot in the 40 years that I've been coming here. It's a lot more now. A lot more French people speak English than used to, though not in Essoyes, really. I mean, if you want to practice your French, you get plenty of opportunity here and in other small places. But yeah, I don't know. I've had this conversation with people in my classes and so on, and I think that the general advice is to try to find some compromise, negotiate some sort of compromise where, you know, you can share, you know, some French, some English, so that everybody's learning.
And Janet, you know, we're getting a little pressure from the chat to cover some, you know, at least a couple of the tips. So I have my own comments on, or listed a couple of them here. Just to follow up on the Bonjour tip, in case anybody in our audience doesn't know this, Janet and I have discussed this, and it's in the book. You can actually be refused service in France if you don't say bonjour. Do you want to speak a little bit to that, Janet?
Yeah, well, I mean, what certainly happens is that if you don't say bonjour, you're not going to be treated the same. That's the whole thing. That's what was happening to me. And so, well, one of the things that people have asked me is, okay, so then what if the only thing you know how to say is bonjour? Then what? And that's actually tip number 2. And that is to, before you start speaking English to someone whose language is not English, at least ask them if they speak English, preferably in French. If you can say parlez-vous anglais, it's not that hard to say, but at least in English, so that they have a chance to adjust to the fact that they're going to be speaking a foreign language. So that's another one, because I think that's one of the things I would see in cafes all the time, is that an American coming into a cafe or a, you know, whatever, and just kind of walking right up to the person and not saying bonjour, not saying do you speak English, in English or French, and just starting to ask questions. And you know, so that it can be done better than that. That's tip number 2.
Okay, and then you mentioned also that if you're up to it, that you know, the importance of saying something like you know, désolé de vous déranger, mais you know, rather than just, you know, kind of bluntly barging into a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things it feels funny to Americans because if you go, for example, if you're in an office of some kind and you want to ask somebody something, um, you are supposed to start by saying, well, of course, bonjour first, and then you say, excusez-moi de vous déranger. I'm sorry for interrupting you. It feels a little weird to us because it doesn't seem to us that we're interrupting the person. They're just doing their job. But it's the polite form. It's what you do to get things started in a good way. You're acknowledging that they probably have more important things to do than deal with you. And then they will help you, hopefully.
Yeah. And then Jean asked the question, is it advisable to add the Monsieur and Madame after you say bonjour? And you do talk about that in the book.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the absolute minimum is to say bonjour, but it's much better to say bonjour, Monsieur, bonjour, Madame, and actually to even say it in that lovely kind of sing-songy way they have. So, bonjour, Madame, bonjour, Monsieur. And there's the music.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And then just to back up a little bit, we have some really great detectives in our audience, and Robbie has found out that the Essoyes originated first appeared in the 9th century. So it's even older than I think most of us were thinking. Let's see, a couple of other questions. Okay, let's maybe move on with some of the tips. One of the tips that you talk about, I think it's tip number 3, and it's going to sound strange when I say it the way that I do here, but in the book it makes sense, is the importance to the French of being pretty or aesthetically pleasing, and not just people, but also places. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, what I say, and I think it's important to know that the whole thing about physical beauty is really important in France. And it's not about being beautiful in a classic or Hollywood or fashion model kind of way. It's really about, when it comes to people, it's really more about just always looking your own personal best, presenting yourself, you know, in the best way. But it's not just people either, it's everything. So that's why Paris, that's why everywhere in France is so beautiful, that you know, the care that is taken to display things in the patisserie, in the boulangerie, and all the little shops. It's because it matters. And the reason that, I mean, and so it's also really important. It's kind of a double-edged sword. In the US, you can, there's not that sort of emphasis all the time on how everything looks. That means that you can be more casual. You can just go, you know, in your sweats and with your hair all awry and run into a bakery and nobody's going to think anything. It's not that way. It's not that way in France. If you go into a place looking not looking good, it will sort of disturb everything. And the way I have come to think of it is that I think it's that they're looking at everything as a visual composition. And if you're not looking your best, you're sort of messing up that composition. So it's just a question of caring about things looking nice. And it is really important.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on that topic, that when I pack to go to France, here in Portland, Oregon is like the grunge capital of the United States. So we don't have to dress very nice, but when I pack for France, I always throw in scarves, my black leather jacket, things that I know will help me be a little bit dressier than I usually am here in the United States. It definitely takes some thought there. You want to talk a little bit about what it's like to be living in France in the pandemic?
Well, I'm in this little, very small village, and it's interesting. Until a year ago, people would often say, and I'm living by myself, so they'd say, "Well, aren't you too lonely? Isn't it too boring? Isn't it too isolated?" And I would always say, "No, I'm perfectly happy here." But nobody's really asked me that in the past year, it's more like, boy, you're in a good place. So here, I mean, it's certainly a safer place to be in terms of um, the virus. It was, I don't know. It's been a difficult period in France, really since the fall. The thing is not really under control. The need for restrictions has gone on far longer than anybody thought they were going to, and everybody's a little bit on edge and a little bit annoyed about that. The vaccine rollout has been slow, but I finally just got my first vaccine from my local pharmacy here a week ago, and they're catching up, but I don't know. I think, it's hard everywhere. And I don't know that I mean, it's different in France because when it first started out, it was so impressive. I mean, the lockdown was extremely strict. We couldn't go more than a kilometer perimeter from our homes. You had to carry a attestation stating, there were like 7 specific reasons that you could be out, that you were out. You could only stay out for an hour a day, I think it was. But it seemed like everything was under control then over the summer, but then things started to tick up in the fall. And ever since then, it's been a little bit difficult for people to figure out what to do.
But that's good. So you're doing okay. You've gotten vaccinated, and the country is on its way to get vaccinated.
Yeah, they're finding different ways to roll it out. I mean, I was very lucky. I actually wrote a blog post about it last week and showed my vaccine center, which is just our little pharmacy here in the village. And so that was nice. I mean, I didn't have to. I know that in some places people have had to go through extraordinary efforts to just get the appointment and then go to some big place and long lines. So it was very simple in the end.
Okay,
so
that's good. We're glad for you. And then in the chat we have quite a few questions, and many of the people in the chat are actually answering a lot of the questions, which gets us off the hook, Janet. so everyone continue doing that. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about chapter 7, which I thought was fascinating. You talked about how important it is for the French to be interesting, and the relative importance of education, knowledge of history, intellectuals, and so forth. And that's something that I think it's really important for us Americans to understand as we're dealing with the French. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways that it comes out, I watch a lot of French TV, and I'm always impressed at the sort of level of discourse on news program. I watch mostly news programs because that's mostly what I'm able to get here. But just the level of discourse is and the ability to argue a point well is something that is taught in French schools very deliberately, very conscientiously, and what results is people who can do that, people who can state an argument and have good thinking behind it. I think it helps to be responsible voters when you have that sort of approach to life. But it's also just what's a good example? Like this sort of delight in learning that is everywhere. Like in Paris, in the metros, in many of the stations, there are these pancards, not murals, but posters talking about the history of maybe what the station is named after, or something. I was recently in Troyes, which is the nearest big city to Essoyes, and I had to spend an hour waiting for a train or something. And they're redoing the whole area outside of the train station there. And there was a whole series of like 7 big panels talking about the history of that square from back in, I don't remember when, medieval times or something, and detailed history. And so I mean, I think the French, they are interested in their history, and they are constantly providing opportunities for themselves to become more educated. And I think it's a wonderful thing.
Oh, good. I was telling you earlier about when France's #1 intellectual came to Portland, Oregon. I was very surprised as an American to see that he had rock star status among the French when he came here to visit, and he did give a fascinating presentation. Okay, Elaine talks about something that you do discuss in the book, and that is that in the difference in the customer being king in the United States and that not applying pretty much at all in France. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, they do not feel that the customer is always right. In fact, the customer is often wrong. And so, I mean, it's just something you have to accept and realize that. So then what happens is that's where the fun comes in, actually, for me anyway, is you figure out, how can I get this person to help me? You can't just demand that they help you, because that is actually often counterproductive. But what you have to do is find ways to, for example, you ask for something in a store and you're told it's impossible. We don't have it. But you actually, this is Adrienne, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to tell your example. Adrienne Leeds writes a couple times a week her newsletter, and this is a perfect anecdote to tell a trick that you can use to get what you no, it's about the pharmacy. It's about the pharmacy.
Okay, tell the story.
So now you're going to correct me because I'll get details wrong. But anyway, Adrienne she needed to fill her prescription, and she went into the first pharmacy and they said, nope, we don't have it. And she thought, okay, so I'll go to another one. She went to 2 or 3 and nobody had it. 6. Wow.
Yeah.
So finally she realized, I have to have this. I'm going to have to figure out something. So in the 6th one, they said, no, we don't have it. And we won't, we don't have it. It's impossible. And so then she said, is there a substitute? And so what that did is it sort of ignited that creative problem solving aspect of the French, which they're so good at. I mean, if you live in a country where everybody is always saying everything's impossible, what that's going to cause is people learning how to make impossible things possible somehow. And so, there was this pause, and then they came up with a substitute, and Adrienne had her prescription filled. Another thing I've used often is to say, somebody, you want to change a train ticket, you want to do something that you've got to do, and they say, c'est pas possible, that can't be done. And then you say, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? What can we do? What can we do? And you say we, because when you say, what can we do? You're making it their problem too. You're putting yourselves on the same team, and it works.
Janet, I would just like to add, that it wasn't that they just found the substitute. She made several calls, went to all lengths, to acquire what I needed, and found it in another pharmacy.
Wow.
And had them save it for me. So it wasn't just, I mean, instead of just saying, no, on n'a pas, and that's it, right? Finished. She actually went way overboard. So that's the other side of the coin.
Right. And it's a good point, because, and it's really the same thing as what I was just saying, is that she took it on as her problem, and she wanted to help. It's not that they don't want to help, but they certainly don't always think outside the box right away. So they sometimes need that cue to help them realize, well, this person's not going to take no for an answer. They're going to enlist my help, and they rise to the occasion, more than rise to the occasion. I didn't remember that. I don't think I even knew that. Anyway.
Yeah, and Janet, on this topic, you cover this really, really well and thoroughly in chapter 2, the importance of the American, for example, initiating the back and forth and engaging the person to help them with their problem. And I thought that was just so insightful. I think we just have time for one more question. Let's tackle the question from, I believe it's Laurel, and she asked, have you found it hard to make friends in French and, you know, in France? And do you have any tips with that regard?
Well, not really, because I mean, the example I told you about, our very first friend in France, the vigneron, who really extended his friendship to us, and that is kind of unusual, I think.
Yeah.
Because this, what you hear about the French all the time is that they're very private and they're very family oriented, and their friendships are long.
Yes.
And formed early in life, and so it can be very hard to break into that. And I think that's true. I don't know. I guess the tip is just, I don't know, patience, and understanding, and realizing that there are different levels of friendship. So that sort of instant intimacy that Americans are so good, or at least it's not really intimacy. It's the impression of intimacy that Americans are so good at. You sit next to someone on a plane, and the next thing you're inviting them to Thanksgiving dinner. And the French are not like that, but they do extend friendship. It just takes them longer, and I don't know if that helps. I hope so.
No, that helps a lot. Yeah, that's I think I found a similar thing, Janet, that we Americans tend to have friendships on a superficial level, and the French have friendships on a sometimes a much deeper level. And that's great for us Americans to understand that there's a different concept of friendship with the French sometimes. We are just a little bit over time. We're out of time, sadly. I think we could spend another hour on all the great questions that are in the chat, but we are out of time. We want to take just a moment, though, to ask everybody to take themselves off mute. Melissa will let everybody do that. You can take yourself off mute and show your appreciation to Janet. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Merci, c'était
Always fun. Always
Merci
fun.
beaucoup. Thank you, Adrienne, too. Okay. Merci, à la prochaine fois.